Heather?
Yes.
Sarah is on. She's in the waiting room, I guess.
I just moved her and John over, so they should be here now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Sounds like we might be ready to go. So I will welcome everyone to this special meeting of Lunenburg Town Council. And also at this time, acknowledge the fact that we reside on Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And that is an opening we will endeavor to make a regular part of our proceedings at each and every meeting and whatever we're hosting as a community. And that was by way of a decision of council as part of our update to our proceedings policy. So henceforth. We have a one item agenda. So I would look to our council for a motion to approve the agenda, please. Moved by Councillor Risser, seconded by Councillor Moser, and all in favor. And there is no one to oppose, so the motion is carried and the agenda is approved, and we will move right along and get to the business of the day. And that is the wastewater treatment plant retrofit engineering pre-design work process and call for proposals. And we're pleased to have with us our acting town engineer, Ian Tillard, and also Sarah Enslin, who's been on contract with us for engineering consulting with respect to our wastewater treatment plant. So I'm very pleased we have these experts with us to talk to us about this very technical subject. And so I would ask Mr. Tillard if he would carry on and introduce what we are going to discuss today.
Sorry, thank you, Your Worship. So Heather, if we could put up that first intro. So the intent today was really to lay out the sequence and timelines that we anticipate are going to be required to, well, we're in the process of and anticipate what the future is going to bring in order for us to get to a decision point on what our best options are in terms of the treatment plant upgrade and outfall upgrades. And really the timelines are built around getting these decisions done in time that we get the preliminary design stage done within the sort of time constraints that we have that have been defined outside of our bounds with regards to what funding is available. And we think we're, in reasonably good shape with that. There are a lot of steps to the timeline, and there's still some unknowns, obviously. So there are some factors that could affect this. So just say that, what we say today might not quite hold true tomorrow a little bit, but I believe we, overall are in reasonably good shape to actually get to ultimately the completion of preliminary design by the spring of next year, which is really the ultimate goal for this. In terms of what council, aside from the initial request by council to put a story together or report together to kind of encapsulate all that's happened and the reports that we have received and the work that's been done, and assessment type work that we have been doing. So that's really the first intent of this report today. But the key points really are a few things for council that we not looking for decisions today, but just to keep in mind that we'll be coming back with requests around these. One of those is looking at the engagement of the Dalhousie University Center for Water Studies as part of the assessment process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also the engagement of a support engineer to help us write the preliminary design RFP. We consider both those activities to be really part of the preliminary design budget. So we haven't worked out details on how that would actually all happen just yet, but stay tuned on that. A really important topic, at least from our point of view, I guess the engineering point of view, is sizing for the upgrade. The plant is at capacity now. And when we look through the Project Lunenburg initiative and to see the sort of language in there regarding looking at 50% growth in town population, to the engineering world, that's a massive impact on what ultimately the plant can look like. That is a significant change to sort of the direction that we're in right now, put it that way. And then ultimately the option selection would be related to what our final selection will be for the plant upgrades, including how we address capacity increase if that is to be accommodated, as well as the outfall extension. So those are kind of the key points for council, I think, that to keep in mind as we go through. And as I said, we're not looking for there's no motion in front of council today, so this was really an information report. And that's it, I guess, from the introduction side of it. So, Your Worship, if it's suitable, we can move on into the actual report. So I've broken these up into, I just have to somehow get this out of the way. There we go, I think. Broken these up into activities now. They're sort of sequential the way they're numbered. A lot of it overlaps, so just keep a little bit of that in mind. And some of this will be a bit repetitive, the first parts anyway, but I just wanted to kind of walk back through the steps that we are taking or about to take to get to this decision point. So the first one was on the DAF review. I don't know if you remember, we're looking at getting the manufacturer down here in Suez. That has not happened yet because of COVID. They come out of Quebec, so again, makes us all a little bit nervous, but we're keeping an eye on that week by week to see as soon as we can get them down here, we're going to get them down here. And that is really to look at the operational aspects of the DAF units and to see what they, as manufacturers, see in terms of what could be improved and what the limitations are and that type of thing. Second item is the flood study, and that's really related to whatever flood measures we're going to need to undertake in terms of a plant redesign, and that's well along. We'll have the final report this month. We've actually had the preliminary design reports presentation here a couple of days ago. So that's all moving ahead nicely. Though there is actually good news there that we, just because of the typical or the topography around there and the Highway 332, we've got some sort of natural, I guess a man-made, but the road provides us with a natural sort of barrier. So it looks like it leaves us in reasonably good shape for the next number of decades with some relatively minor measures. Next item is a saltwater intrusion study that we've talked at length about, and that is now out for tender in terms of getting a consultant in to look at what measures we need to do to reduce or perhaps eliminate or essentially eliminate the saltwater intrusion into our system, which at times gets up in the, I think, 40 or 50% range. So that's a pretty critical item. In-house with Sarah and with John, we're conducting continuous flow trial to look at, see what operational adjustments we can make with the system. As it turns out, that's not possible. It's new news this week. So although maybe not perhaps the news we're looking for was actually good news in terms of we're actually starting to get to understand that system much better, what the performance limitations are and what the control parameters that we have to work within to what the system is, the way it's operating right now, or the way it's designed, I should say. And also we're doing some in-house UVT testing, basic testing on there. This basically looks at what kind of trends we've got and see if we've got an ongoing problem with our UVT system. So Heather, if we can go to the next one, thanks. So I'd mentioned an activity for us sometime in July is, I should have reiterated the timelines that associate with those activities, but I didn't. looking at getting the housing engaged for a number of activities. One is the assessment of the aeration system, the MBBR. What type of bacteria grows? Is it the right bacteria? What sort of growth rates? And I'm not sure all what else, but again, it's more information for us to understand our system better and what can and can't be done with it, as well as for salinity effects on the DAF and aeration. Those are initial things that we'd like to do with them through the summer. So we're calling that phase 1. And then as we go further on into this, and we're looking at, we'll know more about the DAF units and UVT effectiveness. So do we need to delve more into those systems? That's a little bit later on down the road. And that's, if we are going to keep the DAFs, then we probably will be looking at further investigation in depth with that. If perhaps at this point that the DAF does not become part of the ultimate picture, then obviously some of this phase 2 work won't be required. I added the next line in for a public consultation, and I have not been involved in that throughout your history with this plant, so and I don't know what's entailed there, but basically I thought it best added in. There will obviously be some degree of that, certainly for information sessions with fishers and various groups there. So the next, we've got the phase 1 assessments that I've mentioned above with the housing. We hope to get that started fairly soon, and that's an activity that probably would take us into mid-September, that type of time frame. Next issue for us is, as I mentioned, is the sizing upgrades. If we are, in fact, looking at accommodating increasing the number of residents. So by limitation on the plant, what we're saying is that the biological processing of that plant is at its limits. So that means that there's any more material coming in through the sanitary system on its own we've got very limited capacity to accommodate that. So that's as I say, it's a very big topic for us, and I don't know. It's something that as it's presented as part of Project Lunenburg, it's not something that's been sort of widely discussed. I don't think, at least I haven't heard of within Council and others. Other venues there, but it's something that needs to be addressed, and we're going to need to know that really fairly soon. I think I've indicated by the end of August. That's an approximate time frame, but it's a big decision. Yeah, thanks, Ed. So then we think that, particularly those number of those first activities related to assessment, that we're going to know a lot more about this plant, and the final solution at that point will be quite obvious, and that's whether the performance is okay with the plant, and we can basically do some upgrades and bring it up to a lifespan that's appropriate for an upgraded plant, or whether we're still going to be suffering from a lack of performance, and then we're therefore looking at going at a total upgrade, and that may be meaning changing the technology, looking at the different type of MBBR system, or whether we're looking at MBR system. But those decisions can be, that decision, if we get to the decision of we can stick with our existing technology with some upgrades, or no, the other decision is no, we've got to change to a new technology. The type of new technology is not something we need to decide in September. That's something that can be rolled into the preliminary design process to fine tune that decision on exactly what that new technology would look like. And then, of course, the decision on capacity changes, as I mentioned. So along with all that, I haven't really talked about the outfall extension, but this is at a point where we can say that we'll have that decision on what we want out of the outfall extension, whether it's you know, for visual impact, or we feel we need it for dilution because of some other risk factor that might get identified. So then those are the type of recommendations that will come out of staff and any support engineering people that we've got, and we're looking at having that in front of council late towards the end of September. And then of course council's got to review the recommendations and make decisions on the upgrade, including what we're going to do with capacity, although maybe we know that before in terms of capacity, and what we're going to do with the outfall extension. So just a reminder that if we it's decided that the plant upgrade is a more elaborate decision-making process, and we decide that needs more consideration or more discussion, but we do want to proceed with the outfall extension, we can actually split them at that point and start advancing down the road of the preliminary design with the outfall extension while the discussion around the plant is ongoing. And although this is listed after that point, I've got the phase 2 assessments as noted above with the Algae, and again, that relates back to, do we know what technology we want to pursue? And if we are maintaining the DAS, do we need to do some more assessment around the DAS to make sure we know exactly what we are going to assign to the preliminary design group in terms of what upgrades are required with the DAS. We can go to the next one, Heather, thanks. And then we've, of course, at that point, we've made those decisions, and we can write an RFP for the preliminary design. And that's both for the plant upgrades and any flood control measures that are required, and the changes to the outfalls. And now the scope, just so you understand, there's the way the engineering side of it would work, the scope for that preliminary versus detailed design. Sometimes there's things you'd like to do in the preliminary design, or you can leave that into detailed design. So what I've made note here is that the scope will be confined to what we've got for an available budget. Therefore, some decisions that we might want to, we might get deferred into the detailed design. We'd make more broader, not on the important stuff, but on the more detailed stuff gets sort of left into the next phase. So, meaning to say, we're going to tailor that RFP for the budget that we've got for it. So we're targeting the award for that. So mid-October would be great, but the very latest by early November. That should put us in a position to have that work completed by the end of March in 2021, which is our funding deadline. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Sorry, Your Worship. I just wonder, Sarah, if there's anything you saw in there that I misstated or missed altogether. And please.
No, that seemed like a good summary. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much to you both. There's been significant work done, and it's I think comforting to see that there's incrementally progress being made in sort of in the right direction, with a few obvious or perhaps unavoidable setbacks along the way, but I'm pleased to see that we're definitely moving in the right direction here, and having things laid out for us this way is very helpful. I certainly have a number of questions and contributions to make to the discussion, but I would open the floor to other members of council if you want to weigh in or have questions for Ian or Sarah on this topic. Yes, Councillor Moser and Councillor Risser and the Deputy Mayor in that order, please.
Okay, thanks, Your Worship. Got my guy in there first, didn't I?
You did.
Well, I'm pleased to see that we're still considering like the membrane system and all this, because I was The last time we spoke, I was sort of thinking that we were leaving that system behind. So I'm happy that's still being considered. I am concerned though when we talk about capacity issues, because in most of our other prior meetings, you know, it was never indicated that we're at capacity. In fact, it was always that we're quite a bit under capacity, with the exception of the stormwater that we process. And you know, rather than building capacity or spending money to build capacity to process stormwater, wouldn't it be better to, you know, divert the stormwater instead of, you know, making a means to process it? So that would be, you know, that's my biggest concern under that. And the other concern I have, and Ian, there's no reflection on you because I understand you are new here, but this system's 20 years old, and it sort of puzzles me how little we know about it. You know, it's almost like it just kind of landed out of space, and all of a sudden we just say, oh, we have a sewage treatment plant, and we don't understand how it works. That's a little concerning to me as well. But those would be my comments. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Your Worship. I'll let Sarah speak to it, but in the first item, but basically we, as I mentioned, we are at capacity, not in water volume, but in biological processing capacity. Now, having just gone through the upgrades, we'll know a whole bunch more in a couple of weeks, but I'll let Sarah talk to that. I'll just answer the second question in terms of our knowledge of the plant. Well, my knowledge was zero 6 months ago, but and I'll use the example of the continuous flow testing that we've now absolutely defined some operating boundaries for that system that we didn't know before, and why we didn't know, I don't know. I think we're probably just operating the plant and not really thinking about whether there's operational constraints or something like that. So we're now having to look at this in a different light, not to say keep it running, but we're now looking at it in a different light to say, is this the best thing we can be doing for the town for the next 40 years type thing. So it's kind of a different eye on it, but anyway, I understand the point, but I'll let Sarah speak to that first point.
Thank you, Ian. There's two different types of capacity that the plant has and that need to be considered. The one is hydraulic capacity, of how much water you can get through it. And certainly for the town where it has a combined sewer system, there is a high quantity of stormwater and groundwater, possibly in runoff, that comes through the plant that could, with upgrades to the collection system, be significantly reduced. And this would give you extra hydraulic capacity in the plant. What it wouldn't give you is extra capacity to treat the biological matter coming into the plant, which Ian mentioned. And it's not that the town doesn't have enough capacity right now. It has enough, but it doesn't have so much extra that it could fit an extra 50% residents contribution into it. So if you wanted to allow for that degree of expansion in what the plant needed to treat biologically, you would have to consider both the biological and the hydraulic limitations and make sure that there was capacity in place for both. It would be wise to start looking at the ways to reduce that stormwater component so that you don't have to make the plant bigger in both aspects, but you'd still need to make sure that there's adequate capacity for each of those somewhat independently of each other. And as for the operating parameters that we're learning more about right now, I can point to a number of places where the plant is not meeting expectations, but to say exactly how much better it could do is a question until we've actually tested it. And that takes some effort to dig into. And that's what we're proposing to do over the summer. Since the plant does get its biggest challenge in the summertime, this is a really good time of year to be considering the plant performance, because if it can, with the upgrades that are underway now with aeration and media biological capacity, if it can perform successfully through this summer, then that gives a better indication that it can perform successfully into the future as well.
Thanks, Councillor Moser. Did that address your questions? Okay, and I would just before we move on, because that point was on my list as well, the capacity issue. So I think that's very helpful to have that explained, because like Councillor Moser, I was quite taken aback by the statement of capacity being challenged at this point. But I understand what you're saying, and I certainly think we would look to, with whatever upgrades, a long-term vision of both, whatever capacity is, a parallel process of decreasing the amount of stormwater that enters the system, and what that looks like as to, through the collection system. So, we do know they go hand in hand, but we have to plan for both. So Councillor Risser, I think you were next up.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. First of all, I'll echo the comments thanking Ian for the table. I find it very useful, and particularly noting the different decision points. I think that's going to be great to help us avoid path dependence. I have a similar question to Councillor Moser's. Just I'm a little perplexed as to why the capacity issue is a surprise, because we've been discussed, like residential growth and growth in general has been discussed as part of talking about these upgrades for the year. I know maybe it got lost in the transition of engineers, but Councillor Carnevale and myself and others have raised those questions since we got the original CBCL report, and CBCL were the consultants on Project Lunenburg. So I'm just kind of, my first question is, I'm wondering why that's a surprise.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I guess it's the extent of the surprise, a 50% increase.
Okay.
I think it would be normal to expect, oh yeah, we're going to have to accommodate growth, but a 50% increase is a significant jump. And basically, that's really all I can say. I don't know if Sarah can fine tune that a bit or not, but.
Yes, thank you, Ian. A 50% increase means half of the size of the existing plant again. So it is quite a significant increase that would need to be planned for. That said, it doesn't necessarily need to be constructed right now. Even if you planned for upgrades that would eventually accommodate 50%, then it wouldn't necessarily mean that you would need to put all of those aspects into place right away. And it is a larger amount of increase than we would typically see in this average population or escalation of residential growth. Also, industrial components need to be considered as well, such as the brewery contributions and other industries that can have a significant organic load. It may be possible to accommodate it within the plant footprint with modest upgrades to the equipment, but it doesn't look likely like a 50% increase could be accommodated with the plant as it stands. Otherwise, it would have been designed for a significantly larger population at the time that it was built than was actually living in the town, if that makes sense.
It does. I remember asking the Dillon guys when they brought forward their peer review about this, and they said, they made it seem so simple, and as a layman I didn't understand, because they said if we stick with an MBBR process, then all we have to do is really add DAF media, and we could process more. So that seemed to me to take care of the issue, and I was just wondering, why the reversal there. And my second question at this stage is just about the idea that if we don't have things fully designed or scoped, that we can proceed with the outfall extension as a standalone. And one of the things that never ceases to amaze me in the complexity of talking about wastewater is how everything is connected to everything else. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to why, why go ahead with that before understanding the rest of the system and how we intend that to operate.
Thank you, Worship. Well, that was my, I guess, take on what the priorities of things are. And it's certainly heard a lot of discussion around the outfall, as we heard in our discussions around the initial reports. Technically, do we even need an outfall extension? That's an open question, and you could probably get a few different opinions on that. But what I heard was that we're going to have an outfall. So then the question becomes, well, the decision is, what do we need an outfall for? Is it for a visual sort of a presentation, not a presentation, but visual impact? So if that's it, then we get it out to a certain point in the harbor. If it's for mixing required because of pollutants, then that's a totally different matter, which I don't think we're not there. But so those are pretty simple decisions around the outfall. The outfall decision itself, whether or not to have it, it seemed to me that we were pretty well already there, that we're going to have an outfall extension. Maybe I was wrong, but that was my take on it. So,
news to me.
Therefore, okay, all right.
But and this was my point. Like, I think we would probably make a case, and from what I've read and understood from the reports as a layperson, like that the extension needs to be underwater, but whether that's 50 feet, 500 or 5,000 is a whole different question. Yeah. So like if we wind up doing a 5,000 foot extension or whatever for aesthetics, that's a lot of money if it's not for a technical purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree absolutely that we will be able to define that at that point to say, if you want an extension, here's why you want it for that visual purpose, to say, okay, just get it underwater, get it away from that, whatever the underwater breakwater. I don't know what the answer is there, but yeah. So that's a decision we will be able to make at that point. And therefore, if we decide that that has got a higher priority for whatever reason, then there's no, we could actually pursue it at that point, I believe.
So, okay, so it's able to be pursued in light without knowing what we're going to do to the plant, because it's not really a technical requirement. It would be an aesthetic thing that we would be doing then.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sarah, if you didn't have anything to add, I'd move on to the Deputy Mayor.
No, that's fine, thanks.
Okay, Deputy Mayor McGee.
Thanks, Your Worship. I seem to remember when we were first presented with the options that it was actually a council motion that said that regardless of which option we would go with, we would do the extension, even though it was suggested. Now, that can be changed, of course, as the technology becomes more apparent to us, but I just wanted to throw that out. As far as it being a surprise, and on capacity was a surprise to me too, because I think, and I'm not sure where it came from, but I think we've been led over time that, we had capacity, that we had some room there. So, and just, I'm going back to the same topic, but, I was just shocked when I heard how much runoff was coming into the system from just that one or two streets up in Newtown. When there was a study done of that, I mean, with a minimal amount of rain, there was a huge amount of water that was being processed through the plant. And so you almost wonder if it would be maybe as effective for us to come up with a campaign to reduce the runoff, either by, by taking it off the roofs and putting it in the sewers, or even by digging up some of the major streets and putting in a dual system instead of leaving it with the, the combined systems now. So, I sure hope that that's part of the discussion as far as how much would we have to reduce it. With the capacity question as well, you know, this 50% increase. I mean, we've had the plant, and I think I've heard the engineers say that, you know, it's nearing its life expectancy anyways. So if we said even this new plant, if it's going to have a 20-year expectancy or life expectancy, I don't think that the 50% Project Lunenburg idea was going to be within that time frame. I'm sure they're talking about over the next 40 years that we could be looking at that. And so, you know, we may not have to plan for the 50% now, maybe plan for 25%, because I certainly would like to see some expansion, whether it's Blockhouse Hill or, you know, commercial interests on the edge of town. I'd sure like to have the capacity and not have to worry about it at that time. But I would not want to see us plan for, accommodate a 50% increase, you know, at this time. I mean, that would just, I'm sure that would blow us out of the water dollar-wise. And it's like I say, well, dollar-wise, all of these are conditional on us getting substantial funding from both the province and the feds in order to do any of this stuff. So, you know, we were looking at a $16 million and then bump it up to, I don't know, 20 or 25. I mean, I just don't think we could do it. So that's good. Definitely have to be a factor. So enough said on that. But Ian, I want to talk a little bit about salinity for a moment. Like with the you know, I can understand what that does to a plant and what it does to equipment, but were we not sort of addressing that first off with, you know, check valves and so on, as far as the salt water getting into the system? And, you know, are there not other things we could do to mitigate salt water getting into the system? And then I think of the salt on the roads and stuff, which we do a lot of. If you look at our salt budget, which you know that we do a lot of that in the winter. And then I'm thinking, well, what if we were to change to something like calcium chloride or something else that would that cause us other problems? Or would that, is salt on the roads is that an issue at all? Or is, you know, just, can we not just reduce the salinity somehow? That's my second question.
Mute again. Thanks, Your Worship. To go to your, I think your first point, John, was in terms of separation, storm and sanitary, wherever we can possibly do it, we're doing it, which is not a great amount of opportunity at the moment. For instance, on the Brook Street side, we're looking to get some separation in there, which helps in a whole bunch of different ways, certainly in the what you have described. But just to remind you that the whole process of going into master planning and getting a GIS system development. So we've actually got a model of the entire system that includes floodplains, and not floodplains, but what do they call it? The flood areas, or how the water moves around town. All that gets tied. All that's tied together. So it's, yes, wherever we see an opportunity, if we had a pipe exposed there, and I could disconnect the storm or separate a storm and sanitary, absolutely, we're going to do that. And just to further on the discussion around separating out roof drains and all that, we're discussing that. There's no action at this point, but we certainly are discussing that. So that was the first point. In terms of the capacity, you would expect to see some extra capacity, and you would normally expect to talk about, yes, we would allow for something like a 15% or 20% capacity growth, because that's been identified. You would never build something out of the gate with 50% capacity. What you would do is accommodate that. It might cost you a little bit to accommodate. Hopefully everything fits within the footprint. If it doesn't, then we've got a real big problem. But the capacity change, the significance is if you don't account for that capacity, even if it is down the road, then down the road you're going to be faced with, you know, another nightmare. So that's what you're basically trying to avoid with that. So it is a big decision. I'm sorry, Deputy Mayor, you have to remind me on your third point.
Salinity.
Oh yeah, of course. So, absolutely. I think we know of some areas, some places do have check valves on it, but the flows are so large. I think that we need to really try to define this. so we can actually have a reasonably good prediction of what we can actually get it down to and have a sort of a clear indication of what that. Right now, we would have gone and put some check valves in and whatnot and say, you know, cross your fingers. It's more than cross your fingers. It's not that quite that loose, but it's with no real notion of what effect is that actually going to have. We know it's going to reduce something, but we don't really know how much. So we need to figure that out, so that we design that the upgrade so that we know what streams we're designing to, and B, that we actually know that those measures are going to work. So that's what the point of that saltwater intrusion study is, rather than just sticking. Some of that many of you might not know, but we may have underground piping leaking or something. We simply don't know at this point. So we suspect we know what the more significant ones are. But let's get it sorted out and know what we're doing with. The same thing as we're doing with, looking at the DAF performance. That we know, okay, well, we know that that's not going to work, so let's just stop there, and we're now going to refine our process in another direction here. So without that knowledge, it's really difficult. We suspect we could do it, but now we know we can't. So same thing with saltwater intrusion. Let's really understand what we're going to get done here and know what we're going to have for intrusion. I don't know if that helps or not. And Sarah, I don't know if you've got further comments on that. Because in terms of the effect on the process, I think Sarah could, explain that better, certainly than I could, that's for sure. So.
One thing I wanted to mention was that the life expectancy of around 20 years is for the mechanical and electrical equipment, but not for the plant as a whole. So there are still a lot of assets in the plant that have significant life expectancy left at this point. And so you're looking maybe 20 to 30 years down the road, potentially with this plant, before you'd have to do significant upgrades to the tanks, the building, those more longer lived assets. Whereas the mechanical and electrical equipment is what needs attention at this point, just to keep going for the next 20 to 30 years. And like Ian said, it may well be possible to build in ways to expand the plant incrementally rather than to build a plant that can treat 50% more at this point, because you don't need that much capacity at this point. You have already, chances are in the plant, enough capacity for what the needs are today. And then for the, I think there's one more question on the salt composition and whether that would make a difference. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that. It's something that could be looked into if the saltwater study doesn't turn up enough ways to remove salt from the system. That you could look at changing your salts, road salting patterns, or the chemical that was being used to try to see whether it would reduce the salinity as well at the plant. The salt water can have an effect on the biological treatment process and also on the DAFs, and make both of them less effective by either shocking the bacteria that are in the biological treatment system and killing some of them off, and also by making the polymer dosing that the DAF solids removal depends on work less well and be less predictable. So the more that the salt can be removed from the system, the more of an even process the important process components see. So the bacteria have more constant incoming conditions that they have to face, and the DAF performance can also be much more predictable and easy to control.
Everyone had a chance to come to address their concerns. John, Deputy Mayor, you've got your questions answered. I was trying to see what's left because some of the questions already asked were ones I had myself. I am very concerned and very interested in the discussion around the outfall. As the Deputy Mayor pointed out, it was a decision of Council to move ahead with that. I also take a little bit of an exception, or certainly I would question the description of one need being solely aesthetic. I think the part of whatever makes the outfall effluent not aesthetically pleasing as also having impacts in other ways. And so dilution and a desire to increase dilution is an important component in any kind of treatment effluent, desired result. And I know, and perhaps Sarah can elaborate on this a bit more, in previous discussions on this and the question being asked about this. And I know it was standard practice, I think, at the time our plant was built, that outfalls were what ours is, where the pipe simply stopped, and that's where the effluent carried on into whatever body or source it ended up in. But there's a clear understanding now of an optimal level of dilution, and that's one we would, I think, naturally need to strive for. And Sarah, maybe you could speak to that.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think when Ian is talking about aesthetic, he's trying, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, Ian, but I think he's trying to contrast that with regulatory requirements. And so the aesthetic is not, as you've noted, aesthetic alone. It's also an advantage for public health to have the outfall at a position where the public doesn't have access to in the same very open way that it is right now. And you're absolutely right as well that typically outfalls would be designed to provide much better dilution now than the one that you have, which ends essentially on the shoreline. So it's partly aesthetic, but it's also to try to move it to a more suitable position, which it is realistically not in its current location or current level of dilution. And that would also be considered in any pre-design of an outfall, to provide both a solution that takes it farther from the shore so that it's not readily accessible to the public and is not readily visible to the public, but also that it combines it well with the surrounding water in a way that it wouldn't have the same degree of impact as it does right now. And so nothing that was that didn't consider those factors would be considered acceptable.
Thanks very much for that clarification, because I think that's incredibly important. And I also think it's very important that this is, once we hit the harbor, at this point, we really are out of our jurisdiction. This is a federal body of water. There are, and whether or not it was, there are very multiple layers of assessment, environmental assessments and so on that need to be done. So to postpone any kind of pre-design or effort to address this important issue, I think, is a disservice to the community. I think we really need to move ahead with this. And because there are multiple layers to it, and probably the last of which is our concern about how far and what we need to do. On the other side of it, we are diligently, as I think we're demonstrating, trying to improve the quality and ensure we have the highest effluent quality possible exiting that outfall, but we need to come at it from the other end as well. And we need to get on that ASAP. It's been a long time in the making. So any effort to sway from that goal, I think would be inappropriate at this stage. Stop me if anyone has another question or a comment on that.
Councillor Moser does.
So go ahead, Councillor Moser.
Thanks, Your Worship. Well, I do have one comment on that with regards to the outfall and the quality. I mean, I agree absolutely. It's the quality of the effluent that's important. But then there's also that wave break that exists there as well. And I think that could possibly, I don't know for certain, but that could possibly have quite an effect on the flushing action of that area. And that area has, you know, is for some reason very concentrated in higher levels of bacteria that's unacceptable. So, you know, again, that could have a big impact on whether the extension is, you know, the length of the extension. I mean, it needs to be tested before we go beyond, you know, spending, you know, exorbitant amount of money there that may not be necessary.
Thanks, Your Worship. Yeah, certainly part of the whole design process, Councillor Moser, is that currents and whatnot get identified, and the modeling of that, I think, is I've got no necessarily firsthand experience with it, but I've been peripherally seen it in a few projects, and the modeling for this type of stuff is really quite amazing, actually. So that becomes part of your whole design process of modeling what your what the harbor does and what you're trying to achieve, and that pretty well tells you where you need to go. So it's that whole issue around the breakwater will be a pretty important factor in that, I'm quite sure. But they would be able to figure that out.
Councillor Risser, you'd wanted to comment too.
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate the refined distinction between what's aesthetic and what's not. What I was driving at in my comments were what's a technical necessity. So things that, you know, improve effluent and dilution, and those things I wouldn't have classified as aesthetic. I'm wondering though, in the context of the outfall, and this is just me being a layman, so it's a very sincere question. Is it a one-size-fits-all solution that no matter what we do to the plant, we would have the same kind of outfall at the same distance, or is it contingent on plant design?
I won't even wade into that one. I'll let Sarah answer that one.
She's run away from us. No, here she comes.
Sorry for that.
No worries. Did you catch my question, Sarah?
Yeah, yes, I did. Thank you. I will actually just say it back to you and make sure that I've picked up most or all of the question. Whether the length and positioning of the outfall as extended would depend on what the effluent quality coming from the plant was, and different options might lead you to extend it different distances.
Yeah, and overall plant design, like how does the overall design of the entire system influence the decisions regarding the outfall? Yeah.
Well, looking at the distinction between regulatory and aesthetic, the regulatory parameters are ones that the federal and provincial government require to be met at the point where the effluent leaves the plant. So a plant must meet those objectives before it gets to the outfall at all. So you can't simply dilute more through the outfall and mixing in the harbor to make up for unacceptable plant performance. That's not acceptable to the regulators. And so there's a baseline at which any plant needs to meet a certain level of treatment. And the MBBR technology that you currently have is capable of doing that. The existing plant as laid out will get a very good idea over the summer of whether it can meet the acceptable level of effluent. But there are technologies that can do better than this, that could meet a higher level of treatment and produce better than required effluent according to the regulators. And so the MBR effluent would be cleaner than in a number of the regulated parameters, organics, solids, and potentially bacteria as well, than MBBR effluent. And you might be able to extend it to a shorter distance or to a different point. Based on that, there is the possibility that an outfall could be shorter if you had better than required quality effluent, yes.
Yeah, so that if we made the decision on what length to extend the outfall to before deciding on the plant, we could wind up wasting money by extending it longer than we would need to. And by aesthetic, I didn't mean things that would create better quality effluent, whether they're regulatory or not. I meant things that would be for, you know, political purposes. So I wouldn't classify going above and beyond the regulatory parameters as aesthetic. That's well and good, you know what I mean? But I just, thank you, that's very clear.
So I think I'd clarify now too that we are looking at preliminary design work, and we do have enough knowledge at this stage to know we need to extend the outfall. And it's to what extent, to what exactly that'll end up looking like. There may be, as Sarah just pointed out, there may be things that will make the length of that outfall may not have to be as long. But there's, it's not necessarily regulatory requirement at this point. That being said, however, there are regulations about all sorts of things. Right now, people aren't supposed to put their hands in the water near our outfall because of health regulations. And we have a group of people who are working in that environment. So we're creating, it can be argued, an unsafe work condition if we continue doing what we're doing for people in our community. So I think that there is some urgency at this stage around paying attention to this issue. But I also think that there's great benefit in doing that as well. We have to work, as I think Councillor Moser pointed out earlier in the discussion, or one of you anyway, that we are very dependent on other levels of government in accomplishing any and all of our goals as far as this wastewater treatment improvement effort is concerned. And they are, both levels of government are interested and have expressed interest in supporting the effort to improve the harbor water quality and as part of and in addition to the improvements to our wastewater treatment plant. But they're not carrying the ball. There's no department, there's no one picking this up. So we cannot create the partnerships if we don't initiate the action ourselves. And whatever we do, then we can, we'll have a case built. Funding doesn't come from other levels of government. We always hear the term shovel ready, and I don't know that that's when we're talking about harbor water issues and an outfall extension, if that's an accurate or an appropriate title, but it's the same intent that we need to be ready to go. And we need to have a lot of this preliminary work done and be able to hand it to them and say, here it is, this is what we need, help us build it. Or at least we need to get to the stage as soon as possible for them to be working with us to determine what it needs to look like from other regulatory bodies such as environment. So it needs to happen as soon as possible, in addition to all the other things we're doing. Yes, Mr. Tillard.
Ian, your mic's not on.
No. I think it's safe to say no matter what we do, we're going to know enough about this plant in end of the summer, September, that we will know what we need to do. Whatever the decision is, it will be a plant that meets regulatory requirements. End of story. Now the issue then becomes, what is the risk of something upsetting and for maybe it's only for short durations, but exceeding regulatory limits. And that is the issue really that we address. That's not the driver for an outfall extension, but anyway, it's one of the factors one would consider to say, well, there is some risk or there's actually no risk. And that's kind of the discussion one would have at that point to figure out where we are with the risk and what is a tolerance for some risk of exceedance and how do we mitigate that. So that's kind of that whole part of that discussion goes, all those factors get in play at that point. So.
I wonder if we might get back to sort of the specific takeaways that you're looking for from us today, from a staffing perspective as to guidance and understanding of what's required, and back to the question then of capacity and what we're looking for. And my question around that would be, is there an industry standard? So, you've indicated that the amount of increased capacity was sort of the eye opener from your perspective, and we were sort of on the other side thinking we had a bit of room to work with. So, coming at a better understanding of the perspectives we both had, we are, you can't be in this business and not be an optimist, I don't think. So we certainly are looking and planning for growth in our community. What level of growth that is yet to be seen, and certainly will be dependent on how successful we are with whatever initiatives we put forth, and certainly other factors outside of our control. But also, things like there are trends like the cidery being built in our community, and I could see more of that, for example. And we've heard throughout these discussions that puts increased strain. That type of business puts increased strain on our facility. So I'd look to you for some guidance on that, and whether they're understood when you're engineering designing for things like this, you allow for a certain standard or percentage of growth, I would expect. And so perhaps we could discuss that and see if we can come up with something that seems reasonable as a guideline.
You work. Oh, sorry.
No.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yes, absolutely. We would. I think we have to think about it a little bit about how to best approach it, but certainly maybe there's a graduated sort of forecast of where are we going to be over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. So maybe we put some sort of target in there to see what actual impact that has. And maybe there's some intermediate steps in there that we say, well, if we drop that by this much, then that makes a big difference. And if we kick that down the road, or we've got extra room here so we can bring that forward type of thing. So I think that's kind of a bit of a roundabout discussion that would need to be had to kind of how to define that. I don't think it's a matter of saying, give me 50% capacity. It's a matter of saying, give me X capacity now, which we really will have a much better idea. I think, Sarah, it's fair to say that with the upgrade to the aeration system, and once we get better handle on that DAP, we'll be able to say, well, we actually do have, we think X amount, and we've got some feedback on the saltwater side of it to say we'll know a whole bunch more, put it that way. And I think we'll be able to define how we best approach that capacity question. I guess the real question is, what's the ultimate goal? And I think that's where the feedback from Council will be that, okay, what's the realistic, I've not really been intimately involved in that, but what's the realistic kind of view of what our population growth will be? So.
The Deputy Mayor and Councillor Risser both wanted to speak to this, I think, and I'm not sure if Sarah had wanted to weigh in as well, perhaps. Go ahead, John.
Your Worship, it sounds like concurrent to what's going on the engineering side, that there may be some issues we should address too. I know that a number of municipalities kind of regulated pre-treatment for things like breweries and cideries and so on. And you know, if that could be a consideration for us, we should be doing it maybe again concurrently with the engineering studies, because you know, if they don't have to allow for them, that may have an impact. And so maybe if you're a coffee maker or a brewery or a cidery, then you have to pre-treat the water before it goes into our system. So yeah, just food for thought. One other thing.
No, and I'd ask if you have something to offer on that, because we touched on that briefly at some point some time ago, but certainly if there are policies or bylaws the council should be improving with respect to that, then we'd appreciate that guidance.
Yes, Your Worship, absolutely. We've had a number of discussions around this actually. We started to have a kick at this a little bit with notices going out to all the businesses in town to talk about side streaming things such as breweries and coffee houses and whatnot. But it's a matter of horsepower at this point to try to get the time to deal with it. But it certainly, absolutely must be dealt with. That is low hanging fruit right there to pick off. And I don't think there's any big opposition within the business community. We've actually had a couple of people call in to say, well, I'm going to do this, going to do that. Is that good? Yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, so you'll get good response on it. It's just a matter of, you know, dedicating the time to address this. We've got a bylaw right now, or is it a policy? I guess a bylaw regarding the sewage discharge, and I look at it and I'm like, my head starts spinning, to be perfectly honest with Scott. It's great for probably some cases where you've got industries and the potential 200 chemicals they're using, and it might be great in that application, but for the average business in Lunenburg, it's like a bit overwhelming. So I was thinking of how do we get that a bit refined, but frankly, it's just, no, I haven't had the time to deal with it. So. But that certainly is something that's on the radar.
And we can certainly speak to our corporate staff about if there are things discussions we should have, along with the staff discussions on this. And as Sarah, I would just ask if you have any experience, you know, with other municipalities or knowing what's going on in the industry, if you know, there are like templates or best practices that we could pull into this as well.
Thank you, Your Worship. In terms of pre-treatment of certain industries, I think there are increasing expectations that industries will use best practices in dealing with the waste products of their particular industry. And so there is some guidance available on what they can be doing and what they should be considering to be good citizens and residents in the town. In terms of wastewater bylaws in general, I know that the town already has a set of wastewater discharge bylaws. So there are industry standards for those as well. From a preliminary look through the towns, it appears that they're fairly similar. That's not from, I'm not giving a legal opinion, but just the sorts of parameters that are picked up and the types of levels that are acceptable and not acceptable in the system. So it does seem to be reasonably in line with what we see other municipalities using.
Thanks. Councillor Risser, I believe you were waiting to speak as well.
Thank you, Worship. Just to the point, I wanted to echo what you were saying and others about capacity growth, that I think we can build the airplane while we're flying, but I think the important thing at this stage is just not twofold. One, not to close off any doors that we might want to leave open for the future, and secondly, not to do anything that's going to cost us more in the long run than it will up front.
Thanks for that. So getting back to what you'd we were looking for input from us, Mr. Tillard. I don't want to overlook that in the discussion. So how are we doing, and are there specific directions you need at this point? Or I very much appreciate the timeframes. I'm delighted to see so much going on, and that there are relatively short timelines on a number of things, you know, over the summer. But yeah, please advise.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, there's nothing today. The first steps are engagement of, we'd proposed to engage Dalhousie, and we've got a couple of different thoughts around that. So we need to sort that out ourselves first on how best do that, and also to get a little bit more support. And you might as well get that defined now in terms of the engineering side of it to help us eventually write the RFP, because we're not really capable of doing that ourselves. So those are items we probably want to see happen not too distant future here, within the next short number of weeks, probably the next couple of weeks, frankly. But we need to figure out how we're going to structure that first. And so those are the immediate ones. The capacity discussion might be a good one to think about. I don't think we need an answer short term in terms of a short number of weeks, but just how best to approach it. And we all agreed to the 50% target, and it's 50% averaged over the next 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is. Anyway, just some thoughts around that would be good, so that we could actually formulate something to be able to define what we're going to be asking the preliminary design team to do. And I think those are really the immediate things that we need. Well, the sizing thing, I think, is just to start thinking about it, and we'll get back to council regarding the extra support that we're going to need here in the short term. So I think council can expect to see something over the next couple of weeks on that, and be able to deal with that. So,
okay. And
I think that's pretty well it. And then come September, there's going to be there'll be more discussion in between that, and I think it behoves us, as we get through some of this, that we can actually probably best that we actually update council even through memos or something like that, to say once we've discovered more things as we're doing these assessments, and we can kind of help you without getting it all at once. And say September, we can start feeding you back some information as to performance of the DAFs. DAFs are in, DAFs are out, or those type of things. So we can kind of feed that back to you in the meantime.
Okay. Good. Well, we look forward to further updates as you move through the process. I'm glad to see so much happening and real progress being made. So that's a very good sign. So any further questions of other members of council? Oh, Deputy Mayor?
No, just a comment. Ian, when this first came up with the options, I couldn't help but think, how can we possibly make these kind of decisions? I mean, and when I saw your report, I thought, well, that's how we can do it. We can get advice. So that's really, really helpful, because I really want to see a municipal beach over on the golf course in the next few years or so. So we need to get the water as clean as possible. So good job, thanks.
Yeah, always striving for excellence. That's what we should always be doing. So very good. Thank you very much. And I entertain a motion to adjourn. Didn't disappoint, Councillor Risser. Thank you very much. And seconded by the Deputy Mayor. All in favor? Motion carried. Meeting is adjourned. Thanks.
Have a great day. Thanks.